Okay, so now that we've looked at the WCCP integration with the WSA in layer 2 mode from the switch side, we're going to go ahead and configure also the GRE method, which is supported by both a router and an ASA firewall. We can pretty much choose any of these two. It doesn't really matter. The configuration is the same, and the access policies, which we've already configured on the WSA side, will remain in effect and it will be used. So what we're going to do is we're going to take R4 in this case. So for example, as the user which is on test PCA will initiate, let's say, an HTTP session towards ACS2 server. Then we're going to do an inbound redirection on R4's VLAN 43 interface and integrate that with the WSA. So first we're going to go on the switch one and basically disable the redirection which was configured inbound on VLAN 37 because we don't want basically a double WCCP redirection. So I'm going to say no this one and copy paste. And then we're going to go on R4 and pretty much configure the same settings which were done on the switch. So I'm going to first configure the access list, which was called client redirect, which basically defines what traffic do I want to send over to the WSA. This would be an extended ACL. And I'm going to say permit TCP, the subnet, which was 136.1.37.0/24. to any equal port 80. So this defines the user traffic which will be redirected to WSA from the router. And then again, optionally, I can also define I can also restrict the WSA server IP address, which was this one, let's say. This is standard ACL. And then I say permit host 172.16.6.100. And then I'm going to define the WCCP service ID, which let's say this would be 92. And then I say redirect list, which would be the client redirect, which is this one. And then optionally, again, I can say group list, which will restrict basically what WSAs are allowed to join R4. And this was WSA server. Excuse me. And I'm going to choose not to configure any password at this time, so I'm just doing a basic configuration, which will be this one. And looking back at the diagram, I'm going to do the redirection inbound on VLAN 43. So that would be my interface FA0143. So I'm going to say conft interface FA1 43. And then I'm going to say IP WCCP, the service number, which was 92. And then I'm going to say redirect inbound. As we said initially, the router supports both inbound and outbound redirection. So basically, looking at the diagram, I could have configured the redirection as the session from the user was exiting the router. So on this interface, on VLAN 32 interface, I choose to do it the same way, which was the inbound direction. Now I want to go to my WSA configuration to do the integration with the router. So I'm gonna say admin. I'm gonna authenticate in here. So admin and default 1A, login. And then I go again to network, to transparent redirection. And I'm gonna add a new WCCP service ID. I'm going to say it, let's say, users VLAN 37, and then the service ID is 92 this time. Again, I'm using only HTTP traffic to be redirected, not HTTPS at this time. And I don't have any authentication between the WCCP client and server. But then, as we said in the previous topics, because I want to have a GRE method. And basically, if we look at the diagram, which is this one, the router and the WSA are not connected in the same subnet. So I'll do the redirection inbound on VLAN 43, while the WSA is not present in VLAN 43. The WSA is present in VLAN 28. So because they are not in the same subnet, I need to use the GRE method. And the problem with this one is that when I do the redirection, I need to configure the WSA to use only GRE. Because basically, looking back at the config here, if I leave allow GRE all layer 2, most of the times, because the WSA will prefer layer 2, so it will first initiate the session as layer 2, what ends up happening is that it will not fail back to negotiating GRE. So the session, the registration from the WCCP client, which is the WSA, and the WCCP server, which is the router, will never be successful. So that's why in this case I want to specify allow GRE only. So I'm going to go and say allow GRE only, and the return method, it really doesn't matter, but I can use the same one, and I'm going to say submit. I should have said the router IP address, which let's say is 150.1.4.4. So I can basically type in any IP address of the router. It really doesn't matter. 150.144, so the loopback, and then I'm going to say submit. Before I commit the changes, if I look on R4 and I say show IP WCCP summary, or show IP WCCP 92, I should see that basically the WSA did not register to the router. So the session is not yet active because the router did not assign a router identifier. Once I go and let's say I commit the changes, so I'm going to say commit changes, I should see a log message if I have logging enabled. Let's check if I have logging enabled, which I do. I should see pretty soon a log message from the WSA saying that it registered successfully and the GRE tunnel was created. Let's say show IP WCCP, so it did. At this point, I see that the two tunnels are created. Basically, why there are two is because one will be used to send the traffic from the router to the WSA, which will be like tunnel 0. And tunnel 1 will be used if the WSA needs to send traffic back to the router through the GRE tunnel. So this corresponds to basically, if I look back on the WSA, these two tunnels correspond to what was down at the bottom to the for method and return method. Where for method is basically the tunnel used by the router to send traffic to the WSA, and the return method is the tunnel used by the WSA to send traffic back to the router in case it needs to do that. Like for example, the return method will be used GRE if I use, for example, proxy bypass list, where as we spoke already, the WSA will inject the traffic back in the network without proxying it. So now looking back in here, I say show IP WCCP. I see that the router chose a router identifier, which means that connection was successful now. So what I want to do is I want to go back on my client, which is test PC, and let's initiate a session to, for example, ACS2. So based on the diagram, the traffic should be redirected by the router to the WSA. Let's also go on the WSA and enable the logs to see the session being proxied. So I'm going to say tail and then 1 to see the access logs live. Let's give it a moment. Then also let's go to the router and let's say show IP HTTP server history. The last connection was based on the proxy bypass list. The last connection on the routers was from the client's IP address. Let's go on the test PC and let's say HTTP : 150.1.4.4. So I got prompted with the username and password from R4 to connect to the HTTP server. If I do a show IP HTTP server history, again, I see that the session also shows up as being accessed from the client itself. This has nothing to do with the proxy bypass list, but through the order of operation, which is basically which takes first place, the WCCP redirection or the HTTP session. So let's go on the client, say cancel, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to say HTTP : and 172.16.2.100, which this is the session for ACS2. And now I'm gonna on the WSA, and I should see the session being sent through the WSA at some point in time. On the client side, this should fail because the ACS does not have the HTTP server enabled, only the HTTPS server. But I should see the traffic being received here on the WSA and logged. Let's make sure that the proxy bypass list has nothing to do with the ACS. So I'm going to go to bypass settings and only google.com, so it's good. Let's check the config. So I show IP access list on the router. So I have matches on this one and also on this one. So traffic is being redirected to the WSA. Let's go and look back on the logs. The problem, but the real problem in this case is probably I will not see nothing. I will not see the logs in here because the WSA will fail connecting to the ACS server. So basically, if I go and try to simulate the session, let's go on the WSA, and if we do a policy trace. So basically, I would say that the URL would be HTTP URL would be, I'm going to access 172.16.100, and then client IP address would be 136.1.37.100, and then I'm going to say just find policy match. So it goes through the checks, through the policy settings, from the access policy configuration. Now, because, as I said, because ACS does not have the HTTP server enabled, only the HTTPS, I should get a gateway timeout error on the WSA side because it will fail initiating the session to the ACS. So let's give it a while. So I got the gateway timeout displayed on the client side, which basically getting this error actually confirms that the session was redirected from the network, from the router to the WSA, because the display notification page is actually issued by the WSA. Otherwise, this is not the ACS page basically. So let's go back on the WSA. And I should pretty much get the same answer in here on the policy trace. Let's look if so finally I got the logs on the WSA, on the WSA access logs, which were late because of the gateway timeout, because ACS does not basically have the HTTP server enabled. This should at some point in time give the same error message, basically saying that the gateway timeout functionality because ACS does not have the HTTP server enabled. If I look on the switch on the router side, which is R4, and I do a show IP WCCP 92, and let's say detail, I should see that I'm using the GRE method to redirect the traffic, basically. And I also see that packets were actually redirected from the network to the WSA. I'm not sure if I have the answer back from the WSA. It will take a while, but I should basically receive the same answer.